about the Commission statement on ongoing negotiation on the first review of the economic adjustment programme for Greece. We have with us for the Commission, Commissioner Moscovici. We start with you. Please, you have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Honourable members, I'm very pleased to be here with you today to debate the latest developments concerning the adjustment programme for Greece, following on the Eurogroup meeting yesterday, a meeting which was a very good meeting, one of the best we've had on the subject, which is, of course, very important for the Eurozone. The last time I came to talk to you about Greece, I emphasized the achievements that had already taken place, especially the recapitalization of 4 Greek banks, which are the systemic banks, on the reform of the VAT system, the establishment of a strategy to solve this question of non-performing loans, and an agreement on the parameters to establish a privatization fund. So that was already good progress. I also said that there were a lot of challenges left, of course, among which there were the structural reforms to be adopted before concluding the first review of the program. So there was a first stage that we had on Sunday with the adoption of legislation, which is important to reform the pension system and to unify it, to also reform the income post. And just these 2 measures taken together will have an ongoing budgetary impact which is considerable, because it's about 2% of Greek GDP. And it'll make the system more solid, more sustainable, more constructive. And finally, through this reform, all the pension funds for all pensioners will make it possible to have access to the same structure. And this will be fairer, because it's the most modest pensioners who are favoured or spared. And this means that in the final analysis, everybody will get their share, take their share, to guarantee the revenue of the state. Now, these reforms are the result of several months of intense discussions, efforts made by Greece, by the Greek authorities, in close cooperation with the Commission. And of course, I would like to praise the heads of the different institutions, the ECB, the European Solidarity Fund, the IMF. I mean, these are men and women who spare no effort. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they're on the spot trying to work out conditions. And these institutions certainly work together. And these reforms are part and parcel of a package of reforms that are very important, which has meant that we're creating an independent revenue institution and a mechanism, not just a strategy, but a mechanism to manage non-performing loans, and the establishing the parameters for a new privatization fund. And all of this would be priority actions as part of this necessary legislation. And this is what we was asking for. And these measures are going to contribute very significantly to relaunching the Greek economy. And this is, of course, what we want in the final analysis. For 6 years, we've been carrying out these adjustments with one goal, which is that the Greek economy could be healthier, that its public finances be more solid, that competitiveness come back, that growth takes off, and that investors resume confidence in Greece, because it's an open economy that needs foreign investment. And I would mention that the last forecast that I presented has indicated that the economic growth in Greece will be positive again, starting in the second half of this year, that the public deficit ought to be under 3% next year, and that these forecasts are 2.7%. That's a significant figure for Greece in 2017, of course, on the condition that these reforms are actually adopted and carried out. And that's why it was so important for these significant reforms to be agreed on. Now, the great achievement of the Eurogroup meeting yesterday was to say, yes, finally, these negotiations on the reform are concluded. that we have reached an agreement. There are some details to be settled, of course, and votes to be achieved. And this way, the Greek economy will be able to get off to a good start in refinding growth. Then there was a second block in our discussions yesterday and last week, which concerned the need to find an agreement on a contingency mechanism, where the details are going to be settled in coming days by the working group of the Eurozone. And this mechanism does fulfill the criteria laid down by the Eurogroup in Amsterdam 2 weeks ago. That is to say that it'll be objective, it will be legislated upstream, it'll be credible and automatic. And what is this about? Well, we have to find the way of fulfilling the objective that is laid down by the MOU last week of 3.5% by 2018. Now, the Commission believes that the measures already approved will be sufficient to achieve this objective of the primary surplus. But that's not the opinion of all of our partners, and the Commission has agreed with all the members of their group that it would be useful for a mechanism to exist in order to guarantee or to reassure, if you will, all the partners of the credibility of this commitment. In other words, that if this primary surplus was not achieved, then we would have the mechanisms which would make it possible to guarantee that measures would be adopted to achieve it. So, on the second block, we have also reached agreement yesterday. So, what we have to note is that there's the reform package to conclude first review. We've got that. And then concerning the contingency mechanism, with still a few details to settle, we've got that too. Which means that today's message is clear. As you see, Greece, with its partners, has already managed a lot of the path laid down last August, but of course it hasn't reached the finishing line yet. And what to do to reach it? Well, it's important for the measures that I presented be approved by votes in the next weeks. This is a prior condition for the concluding of the first program and the disbursement accompanying it. It's planned that the European Stability Mechanism will pay an important amount to pay the backlog, the arrears of the state, to get the economic growth going again, and this will attenuate the tax effects, which of course could have partial recessive effects. And as Klaus Regling said yesterday, the director of the EMS, it's true that the liquidity situation is tenser, so we do have to find this kind of solution. And then, concerning the third package of measures, this is a question for the member states and for the European Stability Mechanism. But I'd like to say here that the Commission is, of course, very satisfied with the statement approved yesterday. The President of the Eurogroup, Mr. Dijsselbloem, suggested that we deal successively with the short-term problems, and it's dealing with the debt until 2018, without changing the program and without any haircut, because this is two red lines. And then that we see in the medium term, after 2018, if and what extra measures might be necessary. And then finally, in the long term, several decades later, to look at the technical measures that we might adopt to handle the debt without a haircut. Now, how do you say that the viability of the economy of Greece, or the debt of Greece, is fundamental in the agreement reached last year? And I'm very pleased that for the first time in the Eurogroup, we've had this open debate, a constructive debate on this point. A Commission is prepared to contribute in technical terms to these discussions in the future. Now, as agreed yesterday, the teams of the institutions and the Greek authorities are going to work very hard in the next weeks to finalize the agreement, and I'm confident that we'll be able to take favorable decisions at the next meeting of the Eurogroup on the 24th of May. What decision? Well, they can be of two types. First of all, the first block, two blocks together, which could open up the way to the disbursement under the program, and then deciding on an approach to the debt. And of course, it's desirable that these three matters be dealt with together, and that the agreement be comprehensive. But with Mr. Dijsselbloem, we said at the end of the meeting that there were two lines to be followed, and they should be followed in parallel, but they are separate. And we talked about all of our partners to help the Greek authorities to finalize their commitments so that they can benefit from the first disbursement very soon. And after the 24th of May, I will meet with you again to discuss this comprehensive agreement, I hope, which will show the path of the reforms which will make it possible for a return to growth, which will make it possible to have a return of confidence, and which will make possible investments. So, Speaker, members, this is the introduction I wanted to make to open up our debate, and of course I'm prepared to discuss this path we're going to take together in the coming months, but I would just like to say that I'm very convinced that after a lot of hard work together, the path we're undertaking is the good one, and the road to success is laid out. And this meeting of the Eurogroup of the 9th of May exceptionally will remain a strong date in this story of the success of the Greek movement. And, well, that was a good thing, of course, because the 9th of May was Schuman Day. And yesterday we contributed to that anniversary, and we've contributed to the progress of Europe, I think. Thank you.
Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we start the debate with the political groups, and the first speaker is the chair of EPP, Mr. Manfred Weber. You have the floor.
Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues, we're talking about Greece today and the programme for Greece. We should focus on people, the people who are suffering in Greece, who have suffered a lot. And they have expectations. It's the Grecian people, but also in other states in Europe who have a expectation when we talk about there is reform agenda. The people would like to live in a country which can function and uses its tax receipts efficiently, and that the state works properly. The need to reform the apparatus of the state is not just a topic for Greece, especially for Europe. Especially the judiciary must work better in Europe. The wish of people that they have social security, that it's sustainable in the long term. Prime Minister Tsipras says openly there's no alternative to reforming pensions in a structural way so that they're sustainable in times of democratic change and so that they can be sustainable. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a wish throughout Europe that we can't continue heaping up debt, that countries that have high debt, unfortunately those countries that don't have the best future prospects. That means stable budgets, that states don't live beyond their means. That's a wish throughout Europe. And there's a wish for growth, the basis, as Commissioner Moscovici said. The question of growth in the EU. We have the Juncker plan with 80 billion euros paid out already, and I'm happy about the Greek projects financed in the Juncker plan, that there is this investment money there too. There are the wishes round the table that have a lot to do with reforms and change. I'd like to underline that I agree that the Greek government is prepared to undertake those reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, the wishes I've described is the wish list of the EPP, is a reform agenda for Europe. The 5 countries who've got assistance from the ESM over the last 5 years have been governed by EPP governments. They've carried out these reforms and have been successful. Ireland in 2015 had a higher growth rate than China. Just imagine, Ireland had more growth than China. And that thanks for that go to Enda Kenny. So the question is, of the 5 countries who've got assistance, 4 of them are out of the programme already. And only 1 country, Greece, is still in. Why? Unfortunately, there's a political explanation. In 2014, we had growth of 0.7% in Greece. 0.7% growth in 2014. Last year, 2015, under the Tsipras government, they had negative growth. So they had positive growth, and last year their economy slumped. So Tsipras's policies have harmed Greece. The last Samaras program, a year ago, before the end of the program, it would have meant that Greece would only have had to save 1 billion. And that would have meant that Greece would have exited the program. Now we're talking about that we need 5.4 billion having to be saved. That's the current program. And so we have to say very clearly that last year was a lost year for Greece, and the Tsipras government and the Greek economy were massively harmed the economy. Tsipras agreed that he has been naive when he assumed the office of Prime Minister. Unfortunately, being naive is something we can't allow ourselves in Europe and Greece. And Tsipras has departed from many of his election promises and can't deliver many of the things he promises. And we have to say throughout Europe, don't believe the populists who tell you that you can depart from a reform program. There'll be a heavy price to pay. Ladies and gentlemen, what can we do now? The compromise is on the table. I think we'll be able to agree and achieve a lot for Greece. I'd like to point out what the Mr. Ferstakis in the opposition said, who sketched out a clear program for a stable budget, a modern Greece, and the people of Greece can rely on the fact that the people of Europe and the EPP are on their side when we're talking about solidarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I will take blue cards after the first round of statements. So now the next speaker is Chair Gianni Pittella.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Following the first Greek crisis, we find ourselves here once again talking about Greece. Obviously, in the meantime, the world has changed. On the 23rd of June, in just over a month, Europe will be facing an important referendum in the United Kingdom. Europe has also been overwhelmed by the most severe crisis since the Second World War. At the same time, however, we all have the impression that we're in a rather unpleasant remake of a film we've seen many times before. What's this all about? Ladies and gentlemen, there's just one thing we can say, which this is simply excessive efforts to force savings on the people of Greece. We've just heard from the European Commissioner, Mr. Moscovici. He just said that a few weeks ago the Greek public accounts turned out to be better than expected. A whole raft of reforms have been adopted. Obviously, we have to be vigilant. We have to keep a close eye on Greece to ensure that everything promised is done, in particular reforms to the public sector and the judiciary. I don't agree with what Mr. Weber said, in particular one point. For me, the problem today is not Athens. The real problem is called the International Monetary Fund. The real problem are the extremists who, because of a somewhat vengeful vision, want to punish Greece. They believe in this idea of preventive austerity, and they seem to think that Greece should be forced to try out measures which the IMF itself has already admitted would kill off any economy in the world. In the current straits in which Europe finds itself, anybody taking the risk of provoking a new crisis would be irresponsible. The Commissioner, Mr. Moscovici, deserves congratulation when he says that the various different conditions have been fulfilled to complete this process, so as to enable us to move on to debt relief. I'm not saying cuts to debt, but relief to Greece. I think Greece deserves to be proud of this. From the very outset, we as Socialists and Democrats were convinced that it should be possible to find an agreement between the different parties, a fair, equitable compromise which would enable Greece to undertake reforms in exchange for support from Europe and some debt relief. So the time has now come for everybody to shoulder these responsibilities. I'd like to wind up by saying clearly that if the IMF wanted to sabotage once again this agreement, we in the Union have to have the strength to say to them that they have to be willing to go it alone if they want to do that.
There is Mr. Marias, 2 minutes.
Mr. Moscovici, Mr. Weber, it has been 6 years now that we had memorandum of understanding. A reduction of 25% in the GDP, 40% of the population living under the poverty line, reductions in wages and the pensions. We have more than 1.5 million people unemployed, thousands of businesses have been shut down, sweeping taxes, and at the same time the debt to GDP ratio has now attained the level of almost 200%. But we are still going on to pretend that we are working with a business as usual perspective and are asking for further primary actions, for further measures of 5.6 billion euros that were voted by the coalition government. There are further measures of 3.6 billion euros foreseen and an automatic mechanism for hard caps on spending. We are therefore continuing this violent austerity, this violent adjustment like the Samaras government used to do, Mr. Weber. We are continuing sweeping taxes, privatizations without any control. So we have once again a social Armageddon imposed by the Eurogroup, by the IMF, by the Troika against the poor Greeks. We are seeing, as you very correctly said, the remake of the film we've seen so many times before. The profits from the Greek SMP program should have been used for growth and development, and we're still hearing empty promises about debt relief, despite the fact that that part of this debt is odious. Only 9 billion euros out of the 200 billion euros that were given to Greece throughout these 6 years have fueled the real economy. The rest has ended up in the in German and other European banks. Enough is enough, Mr. Weber. The Greek people cannot take it anymore, and we will soon respond to the Troika and such policies. Thank you.
Speaker is Madame Goulard. 2 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you, Commissioner, for being with us today. No, I'm very pleased to hear what you're saying about the fact that the discussions were constructive in the Eurogroup, that things are looking clear. We are aware of this. But I'm a bit troubled still because we've got the impression that our discussions here are insiders' discussions of people who see things from the inside in a rather technical fashion. And now the truth for all the others, for the citizens of Europe, whether they're Greek or not, is that, as earlier because I've said, for 6 years we've been holding these summits about Greece. 6 years because it was the weekend of the 9th to the 10th of May in 2010. 6 years that Mary Matti's report was submitted on the single market, and we see that the lack of growth, the lack of investment that the Juncker plan is trying to compensate for is also due to this considerable slowdown in the Union of the 28. I mean, we say that the Eurozone isn't doing very well, but in the Union of the 28, things are looking better. Now, on all of these discussions on the substance, we get the feeling that we're stumbling, and on the procedure we realize that we haven't made a lot of progress on the legitimacy of the institutions taking the decisions, and I'm saying this with a certain feeling of responsibility. We've done what we could, of course, but even if we're doing what we can when things are urgent, but we have to continue, and we don't see the report of the 5 presidents or the earlier report of the 4 presidents, nor the blueprint of the Commission. We don't see what they're doing. This means that we have the feeling of that things are getting out of our hands. I mean, the Brexit was an occasion to look at the future of the EU. We could have reached a different settlement than the one concluded outside the treaties. And what worries me the most, anyway, said, is the number of things that are being put off until 2018. Commissioner, if we put things up to 2018, it's because in the interest of Greece, or is it because there are going to be elections in France and Germany? Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Papadimoulis. 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Weber, you took 5 minutes of your speech to attack 5 times the Greek Prime Minister, Mr. Tsipras, in order to help out your political friend, the leader of the opposition, Mr. Mitsotakis. But the truth is not on your side, because in 2009, it were the members of the New Democracy Party that has created a debt of 125% of the GDP, a huge deficit, notwithstanding their policies during their coalition government with PASOK that ended with a 180% of the GDP at the end of 2012. So I have to reassure you, Mr. Weber, you did not manage to help out Mr. Samaras, and in the same way you will not manage to help out Mr. Mitsotakis. The Greek people have voted for their Prime Minister and want Mr. Tsipras to remain their Prime Minister. Yesterday was a day, a positive day for Greece at the Eurogroup. After many years of poverty, of unemployment, of cuts, we finally got some good news for the Greek people that will allow us to have more stability, both at the front of the economy as well as at the front of policy making. We can now predict growth based on what the European Commission and Mr. Moscovici is saying. And this will also help the European Union avoid an unnecessary crisis or repeat of the crisis and destabilization in the European South. We have responded to the extravagant and unnecessary demands of the IMF. We have rejected them. We have rejected their calls for even more violent austerity. We have created, the Eurogroup has created a roadmap for debt relief in favor of Greece, also answering to those who were trying to not fulfill this promise, the promise of debt relief. Greece will do its part. Greece will implement the reforms it has undertaken. At the same time, the European Union has to play its part, has to implement its part of the agreement, that is, the part relating to debt relief. Mr. Lamberts, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Jean-Claude Juncker said at the start of his mandate that social justice is as important as public finances being solid. Since the start of the crisis, and because of the emergency plans, we have an equivalent to the population of Luxembourg and Malta under poverty in Greece. That's the price to be paid for the fault in the purse. Who've profited? The financial sectors, the arms industry, but a clientelist sector, those who are paying the price. So I don't agree with the optimism coming from the Eurogroup meeting. We talked about the possibility of talking about debt relief, but the price to pay for starting these discussions is so high. It means that we need to restructure from 27 so that the private creditors can pay their part of the debt, and there are conditions can deal with austerity. This austerity, which the creditors have heaped on, and the IMF think that is socially untenable and counterproductive. And the IMF also is pleading for debt relief. And those who insist on having the IMF on board, because the IMF knows how to deal with the crisis, don't listen to what the IMF is saying, that let up on austerity and restructured debt. that would mean that the creditors would have to admit that they've been on the wrong route, and they can't do that. I have 3 minutes, Madam Chair. Then, all that is absent from the Council conclusions and the Eurogroup yesterday, the question of investments. Investments have dropped by 70% in Greece since the start of the crisis. And everybody knows that the capacity to invest in Greece is zero. And all we can have is the crumbs from the Juncker plan. And we know that that's not enough. The question of putting in place a fiscal plan worthy of its name, the governments haven't shown much enthusiasm to fight tax evasion, but the member states in the Eurozone who could have brought expertise, they've cut 58,000 jobs in public sector. So I would say to you, colleagues, without changing course radically, the suffering in Greece and who've been led to their own devices, given the challenges of the refugees, will get worse. Neither its state, neither its economy can't be reconstructed. All that the Commission, and that's all that the Commission has to offer it, as by ways of a last resort.
For 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In 2001, on the eve of joining the euro, the Greek Prime Minister said, "Thankfully, Greece will finally be at the heart of Europe. We will finally have greater prosperity. We will finally have greater stability. We will finally have greater ability to live our lives in prosperity." Well, face that with what the Greeks are facing today. Greek unemployment at nearly 25%. Youth unemployment at 52%. The numbers of Greek young people who have left their country at 200,000. Suicides since the crash at 6,000 people. The money spent on austerity, over €40 billion. And every month over the next few months, Greeks will have to find €5 billion to pay for those people who are controlling their country. The ECB and the Troika. Well, is that the prosperity, the growth and the great future for Greece that was pronounced in 2001? No. But what you did have during the times of the crash was a man here in this chamber placing his arm around the Greek Prime Minister at the time when the people of Greece had said, "Don't give us the chance of austerity." And I am reminded of the line from Caesar to Brutus, "Tu quoque me feel," and also you, my friend. Because at the moment that that arm was placed around the Greek Prime Minister at the time of the new government and after a referendum that said we didn't want that austerity, what you allowed was the arm to embrace you and the slow knife and dagger of the EU's austerity programme slice itself into the heart of the Greek people. And whilst there are members here from Greece of the EPP and the Socialists who spout solidarity, who believe that they won't care for those Greek people, well, yes, it's fine for you with your champagne lifestyles, but bear that in mind to the families who have to suffer the deaths of their 6,000 members of their families who've committed suicide. Greece is not getting any better because we've already seen after 5 years the economy shrink by 27%. But there is hope for the Greek people. As Mr. Pittelli said, yes, in the United Kingdom we are hosting our referendum to leave the European Union. Our growth has been better. Our job opportunities better because we're not tied to the euro. We don't have the ECB telling us what to do. We don't have control by the IMF. But believe me, for those socialists who vote to stay in the EU, that will happen to you too. To the Greek people, they say the bankers will leave, the businesses will leave, the money will leave your country. I am telling you, the people of Europe will come to your country with freedom, prosperity and arms open wide when you set yourself free by leaving the European Union too, like Britain will do on the 23rd of June. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. de Graaf, 1 minute and a half.
Voorzitter.
Madam President, Greece is bankrupt. The Greek is a patient which needs a financial infusion every 6 months. 215 billion euros, that's the bill to date. And what's been done with that money? About 10 billion euros ended up on the Greek budget. About 140 billion euros have been used to pay back loans to German and French banks, to save those banks. That's to say, EU citizens are paying the terribly high price of the mistakes made by the elite of Europe. In the case of the Netherlands, that amounts to 25 billion euros, money which we will never get back. Money which has been squeezed out of hard-working Dutch people. Just imagine what we could have done with those 25 billion euros for healthcare, pensions, elderly people, reinforcing our borders and our security. Mr. Rutte, the President of the Council of Ministers, promised us during recent elections that not a single penny would go to Greece. What a perverse liar he is. Like so many other European countries, like Greece as well, the Netherlands is now suffering the consequences of austerity policies. All of this has been artificially kept alive by a failed and artificial EU and an artificial euro. President, we have to close this tap. We can't continue sending billions to euros. We can't continue to cut the pensions of EU citizens. The euro must be scrapped. Greece must go back to the drachma. Enough is enough.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Papadakis. 1 minute.
Madam President, we have a new law which is demolishing the social security benefits of the people voted by the coalition government, and the sweeping taxes continue. This law may have been voted by the parliament, but there is no democratic legitimacy in that. Despite your debates, you all agree on one point, that the European Union, the IMF, everyone agrees on what we want to achieve is cheap labor and more privilege for big businesses. You are serving the big businesses, and who is paying the bill? The people, the ordinary people. And this will continue to be the case as long as we have austerity policies, automatic spending cuts and measures against the people taken both in the European Union and in Greece. There is only one way to change this: to oppose the capitalist economy and to have the people reclaiming the wealth they are producing.
KEFALOGIANNIS, 1 minute and a half.
Thank you, Madam President. Winston Churchill was right when he said that if you want to no longer have a problem with the left and the populists, you have to let them run the government for a few months. And we've seen that happen in Greece. The few months of the left coalition government has cost the Greek people a lot. Under the Tsipras government, the targets set for austerity measures were around 1 billion euros. And for the Tsipras government today, we have a target of 5 billion euros at least, and a further package of measures amounting to 3 billion euros. Because the Tsipras government has taken the easy road. They are increasing taxes. But when someone is increasing the taxes, the public revenue goes down. We know that the adjustment program might not work, and we might find ourselves once again in December discussing about new measures. Europe has already shown its solidarity. There has been a haircut of the Greek debt in 2012. We have limited the repayment needs to 4 billion euros from 16 that they used to be. So debt relief cannot be used by the Tsipras government to evade its responsibility for a failed negotiation. We need to see investment in Greece. We need to allow the productive forces of this society to create wealth. And this is the only way to create growth in my country. Thank you.
Next speaker is Mr. Gualtieri for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it is difficult to deny that the Greek memorandum of last summer is very ambitious in its attempt to find a balanced approach between stability, growth, competitiveness and social fairness, but is also very demanding because it is fully front-loaded in its method and is extremely broad in its scope. At the same time, I think it's equally very difficult to deny that this Greek government is delivering and is seriously committed in making reforms and implementing what has been agreed. For these reasons, it is positive that finally an agreement has been achieved on the policy package of the fiscal and structural measures which are necessary to conclude the first review of the programme. I also consider a good result that the contingency mechanism will be based on the Greek proposal and will not impose on the Greek people additional preventive austerity measures that would have been politically and economically destabilising. I note that the institution that has strongly advocated this option has produced an economic forecast on the 2015 primary balance that has proved to be totally wrong, and this would have called for more prudence, which hopefully in the end is materialising. Finally, I strongly welcome that the discussion on additional debt relief has taken place and that now there is a guidance and a clear mandate to identify specific measures like maturity extensions, grace period and interest deferral on the basis of the three-stage approach that, and this is another positive element, does not exclude further measures in the long term. So yes, the 9th of May has been a good day for Europe, and I would like to thank the Commission and Commissioner Moscovici in particular for his crucial role. Now, we strongly encourage to finalise the Eurogroup guidance by the 24th of May in order to put Greece on the path of stability, growth and jobs, and in order to give a clear signal that Europe is able to address and solve difficult crises and can do whatever it takes to preserve its stability and integrity.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Lucke. 1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's surprising to listen to these speeches who distort facts and think that we can continue as usual. It's 6 years to the day that the European treaties were breached by and the bailout mechanism being set up. We said that in 2010, we said it would be 3 years and Greece would be on its own 2 feet. But now, 6 years later, Greece is not on its own 2 feet. We're talking about 2016, 2017, 2018. Commissioner Moscovici said over decades we'll have to help Greece with its debts. These policies have failed, ladies and gentlemen, and the Commissioner is pointing out that Greece will do better. We've been hearing that for years. The Commission has been talking about several percentage points above reality. Mr. Petilli, in the Socialist, says that the EMF is guilty for the crisis. He is distorting facts. Greece isn't saving in advance. Greece must save, even though it's 6 years since Greece should have been on its own 2 feet for 3 years. The policies have failed. Greece must get out of the euro and get debt relief.
Mr. Lucke, you have a blue card from Madam Grappini. Do you accept it?
Mulțumesc, doamna președintă. Mulțumesc că a treia oară îmi dați voie să adresez o întrebare. N-am putut colegilor dumneavoastră probabil.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to ask my question. Mr. Lucke, I listened to what you had to say, and what you said reminded me of what your previous speaker from the EPP said. Greece is a full member of the European Union. It is stated clearly in the treaties what solidarity actually involves. However, what's your understanding of the word solidarity? when it comes to helping a member state which has problems.
Mrs. Grappini, I quite agree that we should show solidarity in the European Union with those who are poor, who don't have enough infrastructure, whose social structures and social support isn't what we would wish for. But I don't think, Mrs. Grappini, that we should show solidarity with those who don't manage their economy properly. I don't think that we should show solidarity with those who are over-indebted. I don't think we should show solidarity with those who don't take the agreed measures in the programs. For years, we must show the principle of conditionality and show that if you don't deliver, we won't pay up.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Arthuis, 1 minute.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. In the negotiations between the European institutions and Greece, we get the impression over 6 years that this is a pretty sinister spectacle, that is a financial cavalry and the incapacity of deciding. If Greece has been at the border of the abyss, it's just as much its own responsibility, because they falsified their public accounts, as that of the creditors, of course, also guilty. In 2009, they should have already noted their losses and then to bring Greece debt back to a sustainable level and to leave it up to the national authorities the responsibility of finding democratically the appropriate responses to gain the confidence of the lenders that they needed. Now, instead of that, we established incomprehensible and unsustainable mechanisms. How can you leave a country with a public debt corresponding to the double of its GDP? Well, today the Eurozone is in danger, Commissioner. The Stability Growth Pact is no longer being respected and its governance is diminishing. Now, if we're granting loans to reimburse earlier debts which are coming due, well, we're just prolonging this situation which can only lead to disaster. The decisions in the corridors have to give way to realism.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Chountis. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Commissioner, yesterday's decision by the Eurogroup is the imposition of the rule of the powerful against a less powerful member. You have once again promised that the debt relief will come in the future, sometime in the future, without explaining when. And once again, we've had austerity measures taken on the basis of this promise. We have given the keys of the Treasury to the creditors. The creditors will now be legislating in Greece on economic policy. They will decide about the primary surplus. They will decide about the tax rates for big businesses. They will decide about the taxes paid by the ordinary citizens. Mr. Moscovici, we have created a Europe of unemployment, of recession. We have created a parliament in Greece that is only rubber stamping. And you know you can expect an answer from the Greek people and also from the French people who have taken the streets to protest against the policies of their government. Thank you.
Mr. Chountis, there is a blue card for you coming from Mr. Szanyi. Do you accept it? Mr. Szanyi, 30 seconds. Please.
Köszönöm szépen a lehetőséget, elnök asszony, meg önnek is, képviselő úr, hogy fogadja a kérdésemet.
Thank you for accepting the question. I think it's the hour of truth. I'd like to ask you, what would be the solution? We've heard a lot about what the solution shouldn't be. In your opinion, what would be the solution?
Thank you, Mr. colleague, for this question. Dear colleague, we knew the solution. The Commission knows the solution. The Eurogroup knows the solution. Everyone knows the solution. Debt, Greek debt, is used as a lever to impose economic policy. When we understood that there was a problem with the Greek debt back then. We could have immediately implemented debt relief measures instead of creating a new treaty, instead of creating new mechanisms that perpetuate austerity and memorandums of understanding. So they knew there was a solution. They opted not to use that solution, and based on data coming from a German think tank that were presented by my colleague, out of the hundreds of almost 200 billion euros that have been given to Greece over the past few years, the vast majority of this money ended up in German banks, and the failure has been accepted by the Commission and the institution.
The time for the next speaker, Mr. URTASUN, 1 minute.
No puedo evitar.
I can't help but smile when I hear the EPP giving the Greek government lessons after having destroyed the country's economy and having cheated the accounts to get into the euro. So I think you're going a bit too far, sirs. What I would like to say is that what's happened over the last few days has left us in a sort of impossible sandwich between the rational demands of European creditors who don't want to restructure the debate when everyone knows they have to do that, and the suicidal measures which are being demanded by the IMF. Yesterday we took a small step forward, but I don't think it's sufficient. Commission, I think we need two things. First of all, to restructure the debt in a more ambitious way, and we have to do it as quickly as possible. Since 2010, we've known the situation is not sustainable. We have to move towards sustainability as quickly as possible. My second point, just to wind up, is that the country once again find itself with 1% extra of primary surplus compared to what's provided for by the programme. It's starting to emerge from recession. I think it would be suicidal to add recessionary measures to the country. We need decisive measures, and I think that what we're doing here is instigating a sort of preventative austerity which is quite inappropriate. What we have to do now is to stimulate the Greek economy rather than simply placing more burdens on it. Thank you.
There is a blue card for you from Mr. Frunzulică. Do you take it? Yeah. Mr. Frunzulică, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Madam Chair. In fact, our colleague was mentioning something about, the situation between the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. In fact, Greece made some progress considering in fiscal terms, I would say it. And at the end, probably, and this is my question to you, don't you think so that at the end, the European Union and the International Monetary Fund should have to find a common, maybe political and, of course, financial solution?
Thank you, Mr. URTASUN.
Dear colleague, I think that would be the ideal situation, but that would mean and that would require to have rational terms, in the sense that we need the debt restructuring, and that the Europeans do not want to accept, but we need that, and we need to avoid more recessionary measures. But we need both things. If on those two grounds we could find a common agreement, of course that would be ideal. But those two things are necessary, and up until now both the IMF and some of the European creditors have been blocking.
Thank you. Mr. ZANYI, 1 minute.
Thank you. Yesterday we were singing the European anthem, the Ode to Joy, to March Europe Day. At the same time, however, we should also be playing a funeral march. The Greek government has endorsed yet another so-called bailout package. All the previous packages have failed. Just 2 years ago, the Andesbat study showed that 9.7 billion euros of the 216 billion of the first package actually went to the people of Greece. The remainder went to international finance institutions. The third programme repeats the same mistakes. A 3.5% increase in the primary surplus and an increase in debt. This is economic folly. At the same time, it's social suicide. This is a crime to the Greek people, forcing them to bankruptcy, enormous tax pressure, destruction of social rights, and 12 different reforms to the pension system. As if that weren't enough, the group has now called for further cuts in case the targets weren't achieved. So once again, the Greek economy is being bled to the bone. There are no future prospects for the country, and there won't be until it's released from the clutches of the euro.
Speaker Mr. WILIMSKY, 1 minute and a half.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, how often have we heard that the current package for Greece will work, will bring stability, and will be able to turn Greece round. How often in all 28 parliaments of the member states have we heard that the current billions for Greece will help? Today we know that every package has made the situation worse and worse still. The mountain of debt is 183% of GDP. Everybody would say that, economists would say that can't be financed. And this week in the Spiegel, the European Institute for Management and Technology shows that 95% of the aid hasn't gone to the people in Greece, hasn't gone to the SMEs in order to turn the wheels of the economy. 95% gone into the coffers of the banks, and the banks from the start have carried out a harmful policy. They have lent cheap money from the ECP and bought loans and haven't had to assume responsibility for that. The only way of out of this crisis can be for get Greece out of the Eurozone so that Greece can become competitive step by step, and both areas, those who aren't affected by the assistance measures, and give Greece a possibility to have a decent future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Fontoulis, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. We are seeing the same film over and over again, and I'm impressed to see such indifference towards the suffering of ordinary people in Europe. We are following blindly the policies of Germany, and they have found a new willing Prime Minister to follow these policies. They have betrayed their promises, their own promises to the Greek people, and they have offered the Greek people and the country to our creditors and so-called allies and partners in the EU. In the process, they have destroyed all the social benefits, the health system, the education, and everything else. What happened is that the big banks in Europe have managed to write off their losses to the European governments, which were then undertaken by the public. We know that 95% of the funds given to Greece ended up in German banks, according to the study published by Handelsblatt. We know that the debt to GDP ratio has doubled, and we are still listening to the European Commission describing the situation, despite the fact that we know how this will all end.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, I think we're moving in that direction, we've heard, but we've had to wait a long time before the reforms started to be adopted since the arrival of Alexis Tsipras, and it's a shame that we've lost so much time, because we do recall that at the time of the Samaras government we saw growth starting up again. However, we have to be pleased with this progress that's been achieved, but to say that the first author of this progress is the Greek people, and they have been awfully courageous. The Greek people have had to make tremendous efforts without seeing direct benefits, and they're going through still a very difficult situation. And it's also the Greek people who are in the front line. They've had to assume the consequences of this opposition to each incipient reform. There's still too much disparity in the Greek economy. There's too much privilege for some and too much poverty for others. So we have to be clear. The Eurogroup hasn't given their blessing to Greece. The Greek government has to be very aware that European flexibility is determined by their making reforms. And I'm pleased that the Eurogroup has started talking about debt relief, this debt which is still 180% of their GDP, and this can only be accepted by public opinion in Europe if there's this counterpart, that is real efforts to stabilize the economy of the country. But finally, today we have to recognize that without the solidarity of Europe, even if it's criticized here and there, Greece would still be in an even worse crisis.
Thank you. Madam Grossette, there is a blue card from Mr. Epitideiois. Do you want to take this? Okay, Mr. Epitideiois.
Thank you, dear colleague, for accepting my intervention. You referred earlier to the progress made in Greece by the Samaras government. Are you aware that he is among those who are responsible for the sad economic situation of this country? He has signed an MOU which was the forefather of the present one, and he was also one of those who have violated the democratic tradition by sending to prison the head of our party and members of our party. Is this Mr. Samaras for whom you speak favorably?
The only thing I can note is that in Mr. Samaras's day, we could already see that there was growth returning in Greece. I remember discussing this at the time myself, because in France we couldn't even achieve that level of growth. So my conclusion is that reform is underway. Admittedly, there does have to be a sharing of responsibilities, but nonetheless, that initial burst of growth was a good sign. It's so sad that so much time has been wasted.
Mr. Bullmann, 1 minute and a half.
Ladies and gentlemen, I believe, with a view to the Eurogroup, that slowly but surely sense is returning to the discussions of the finance ministers. And Commissioner Moscovici, I'd like to thank you personally, you and your staff indeed, for the contribution that you have made to this. And this is work that needs to be continued. On the 24th of May, we need results. Unemployment, strikes, investment, a massive shortfall since the world financial crisis 2009-2010. We need growth and jobs for people in Greece. Ladies and gentlemen of the EPP, there were 3 prominent speakers, each of whom have said that their government in the south of Europe always does everything right, everybody else does it wrong. I don't even believe you believe what you're saying there. If you come back to plenary, I would like to hear the list of reforms that Mr. Samaras has actually achieved. Please tell us about those. Otherwise, that argument really doesn't hold water. We need to have an economic perspective, not just for Greece, but for the whole of Europe. We have to discuss how the skills and talents of the people in southern Europe can come to fruition again, who can participate in the labour market again in the European Union. And that is a debate that we need to move towards, slowly but surely, rather than just having to talk about overcoming debt. Thank you.
Next speaker, Mr. Starbatty, 1 minute.
Madam President, Mr. Pittella was saying that he felt as if he was in a film. Well, in a way, I feel the same way. It seems that we're seeing, the same scenes being played out time and time again. And I've gained this impression very often. I've heard all this kind of thing about what we should do. Moscovici said, what Greek must have to... Well, basically it's a program to disempower the people. Now you're going to get growth, investment, competitiveness. No, far from it. The Economist wrote that the Greek economy is hopelessly uncompetitive. And do look at the statistics. Why in Germany is the number of unemployment gone from 10% to 5%? Why in the south of the Eurozone is unemployment gone from 10 to 15 and indeed more %? Because the euro is wrongly priced in relative terms. However, this House doesn't tackle the problems, but just dances around worshipping the golden calf of the euro. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Torvalds, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we
we should take a slightly broader view at the problems. If you look back in history, you can see that in the 50s and the 60s, the general trend in Europe was that everybody was going sort of 5 to 6% into the future, coming close to the gate of Peter. That changed in the mid-70s. What we need now, and that changed even more after the enlargement in the 90s, what we need now is a new cohesion policy. But to be able to have a new cohesion policy, we need a budget which is appropriate to those challenges. It's not much use to speak in this chamber about who did what wrong. There is not a single politician in this House or in any other parliament that can say that he did all the things right. Almost every politician has something on his back. So we should stop blaming each other. We should work for a new budget, and we should try to fix the problems of those countries in Europe that are really in dangerous water. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Sakorafa, 1 minute.
Ένα λεπτό. I am very happy that most of you today recognize that a crime has been committed against the Greek people. But my dear colleagues, yesterday's developments confirm once again that there is a dominant power in Europe which once again does not care for democracy, human lives and rights. They impose triggers, MOUs and pain. There is also in Greece a prime minister who implements this policy, who says that a radical alternative way is an illusion. There is also in Europe a power which has been registered in here who has no illusions about MOUs and is in favor of social justice. There is in Europe a people who has no illusions, has not submitted, has not given in to blackmails by the director and has said no to the saving of the banks. There are two types of reviews. The one that counts submission of the Greek society and the one which counts the resistance of the Greek people and as a benefit for European society. So there are two conflicting realities. Which one of us is reviewed depending.
President, Commissioner, the Handelsblatt newspaper said a little while ago that 95% of aid to Greece had ended up in the pockets of its creditors in the European banks. Greece is paying a very high price for getting access to the remaining 5%. The austerity mission that the Tsipras government has had adopted must be met by fresh scrutiny of Greek indebtedness. Yesterday, the Eurogroup made a timid start to discussing that so that they can drag things out a little bit longer. But they're going to wait till the end of the current programme, which runs up to 2018, before revisiting the issue. But how can an economy hold out any prospect of the future in such circumstances? If you look at the socio-economic circumstances, in 2018, when the effect of this new austerity plan has gone through, there will have been such a devastating position that we will need the haircut of all haircuts. Greek people will be in a desperate situation and creditors won't get their money back. So why persist on this course, Commissioner?
Thank you. Madam von Storch. She's not here. Next speaker, Mr. Philippot, for 1 minute and a half.
Last Wednesday, the Handelsblatt, a very important German newspaper, finally said what a lot of people have already been saying for a long time. The support going to Greece is not going to the Greeks themselves, but to the banks. At least only 5% of that money that we've all paid into the pot has effectively been injected into the Greek economy. The price of that tiny contribution has been a complete undermining of their democracy. Back in 2020, even though the IMF thought that there would be a default increase, you, especially in the Commission, set up a veritable Ponzi system. You wanted to save the banks rather than save the people, and to pay back the debt, the Greek state had to just keep on borrowing more and more and more. And over and above that, the punishment that you imposed on Greece was even worse when they chose a different democratic way, electing Mr. Tsipras, and then about a year later voting down the aid plan. You subjected Mr. Tsipras, who didn't have the courage to resist you and didn't have the courage to choose to end the euro for his country, but the European Central Bank is holding everybody to hostage with this idea of liquidity, and yet you still have obligations to the Greek people. But it's obvious that the choice that's made is what should be in question. You yesterday were proudly celebrating so-called founding fathers. I hope that we won't see a further anniversary and that finally we'll be listening to the people and see cooperation between free peoples and free nations, which is the only one that will work.
Mureșan, 1 minute and a half.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Dear colleagues, Commissioner, the situation in which Greece finds itself now is the result of political actions undertaken by this government since it took office. Greece was on its way out of crisis in the second half of 2014. It had projected economic growth of more than 2% for 2015 and a primary budgetary surplus. But this was all jeopardized by the current government last year. Keeping banks closed for 3 weeks would harm any economy. But what is the way forward now? The way forward, in my view, is reforms. What Greece now needs is reforms. Greece needs a functional and efficient public administration. This would be in the benefit of the people. Greece needs more competitive and flexible labour markets. This would help people find a job, especially young people. The government should make it easy for young people to start their own business. Education needs to respond to the needs of the labour market. Enterprises need to be privatised and well managed. This all will make Greece competitive. It will lead to investments and new jobs. These measures work. We have seen it in Portugal, in Ireland, in Cyprus, in Spain. Only if applied completely will this package help Greece. Unless the economy is competitive, strong and reformed, everything else is just a quick fix. Even debt relief alone will not help. Reprofiling debt alone will not regain the trust of investors, and new debt will accumulate unless the budget is brought in order and the economy is reformed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madame Berès, 1 minute and a half.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, Commissioner, in the different varying interpretations of the situation in Greece, I think I can say that we can draw 3 lessons from the Eurogroup meeting yesterday. First of all, the huge efforts deployed by the Greek government to carry out reform should be warmly welcomed. The laws adopted by Athens on retirement and elsewhere entail 3 billion worth of saving, and also Mr. Tsipras made certain commitments on Friday. So it's political credibility of Greece it shouldn't be questioned. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We should welcome the increase in it. There's the second question of the Greek debt. I think common sense is beginning to prevail, but here once again we need to move ahead on a promise we made to the Greek people in summer 2012, renewed last year. Thirdly, despite the progress made, the grounds for optimism needs to be justified by clear actions. The 24th of May is a very important date. Measures will need to be put in place to deal with the Greek debt so that the insurance markets and other markets can start looking to the long term. That's what Greece needs the most. And indeed, not just Greece, but the whole Eurozone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Monod, 1 minute.
Despite your wonderful European agreement signed in August 2015, none of the problems in Greece have been solved, as the IMF has decried the Euro austerity imposed by the Troika on Greece is just making the country weaker and making it impossible for the Greek public debt to be repaid. You don't want to admit that it's the whole Eurozone that's dying and that Greece is just a symptom of the cancer of the single currency. You say a debt is a debt, and so a partial relief, a haircut would be irresponsible, because that would
light the touch wire for under European public finances. But we do need to reduce Greece's indebtedness if there's to be any way out. But that means it would need monetary sovereignty as it emerges from the Eurozone. Then Germany's war reparations need to be paid. We can thereby avoid an economic crisis in the cradle of democracy.
1 minute and a half.
President, in Greece we have some good news but also some bad economic news. Good news is that Tsipras government has abandoned the strategy of fighting against the Eurozone and is making the necessary adjustments. Therefore, we will not see the crisis of 2015 repeated. But unfortunately, there are bad news. First of all, we have a very high price to pay for the bill of the failed experiment of Tsipras Varoufakis in 2015. Secondly, the economic mix policy of the Syriza government focuses on a very heavy taxation on businesses, and therefore there are problems in the functioning of the economy. Thirdly, on the demand of the IMF, Tsipras government has accepted the creation of the contingent measures in view of 2018. Therefore, the message is sent that the Greek problem is not especially credible, and therefore the front-loading character of the program and the third MOU is abolished, and therefore the growth potential is limited. And this, of course, is a result of the cost of left-wing populism. Syriza brought about elections in 2014, and therefore Greece was not able to exit the MOU with measures of 1.2 billion euros. Still, the Tsipras government has either announced or planned measures worth 10 times as much. This is very telling about populism, and I hope that the lesson learned by the Greek people will be learned by the European peoples too. Thank you. Thank you, my dear colleagues. While the Greek people is suffering more and more further pension cuts and higher tax hikes against the poorest levels, some are very happy because this is in their view, carte blanche to the Troika. Sometimes we are very hypocritical here too. Today, the alibi for the IMF dragon has been abolished, because today an agreement was accepted that goes against the weakest among the citizens. It is only the Schäuble policy that is being served, and therefore any debt relaxation is postponed for 2018, while the properties of the Greek people are going to be sold off to foreign funds, while at the same time the government are celebrating. So we should not be discussing solidarity if we're not interested in citizens.
1 minute.
Voorzitter. Thank you, President. When Mr. Schäuble arrived at the Eurogroup yesterday, he said that Greece had taken the wrong decision and would have to pay a fine for it. It recalls the story of Tantalos. The closer you get to your goal, it gets moved further ahead. Greece has carried out a huge adaptation. It was needed to get in balance, and yet last year there was talk of 3.5% surplus. The goal's been moved. So despite everything that Greece has done, you can look at the unrealistic demands of the Eurozone countries. Lagarde has said that 3.5% is unrealistic, and the IMF has acknowledged that in 2010, when it put the question of indebtedness on the agenda. The EU countries need to look critically at the way they've dealt with this themselves, not just Schäuble's talk of fines. I think you can learn from your mistakes. Well, on 20th of May, it has to be clear that Greece's debt can be relieved to the extent that it can actually make a recovery.
Mr. KYRKOS, 1 minute.
Yesterday's Eurogroup has shown to us that European institutions and Greek governments are collaborating in a very smooth manner. 6 years of crisis, 3 MOUs, 12 positive reviews. And we always have a government which is very happy to tell us that there is a good result will be tomorrow, but we still see taxes and cuts. Why is that? Because European institutions forget about growth and only plan for fiscal objectives which collapse because of lack of growth. But 12 positive reviews have shown to us that there is no way out unless important reforms without a fiscal cost take place, such as the lack of subsidies or the faster administration of justice, doing away with the contraband in oil, things that 2 governments have not even dared touch and the current government has not even started doing.
1 minute.
With a microphone, please, sir.
Now it's working.
Perfect. Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, I'd like to thank Commissioner Moscovici for the work he's done over the last year. Last spring, there was a last-minute referendum when just on the verge of reaching an agreement. We probably wasted a year odd, and now we have an agreement which is reasonable, even though members of this parliament, such as Mrs. KAILI, call it into question. Rightly, she calls into question the trust we can, or confidence we can have in a series of governments. Still, it's a reasonable agreement. I think reforms should be focused. Few reforms, but reforms that unleash the capacity for growth, particularly in the export sector. We really want that kind of reforms that will lead to growth. And as Mr. Tang said, we've got to tackle the question of debt. That's there in the agreement, but we really can't wait off any longer. Greek citizens can't keep on suffering cuts without any kind of hope for the future, which will allow them to recover confidence in Europe.
1 minute. It's working.
Thank you, President. Mr. Moscovici, much has been discussed today about the past, but very few about the present and the future. And the question is quite simple. A roadmap has been agreed. Although belatedly, this moves into the right direction, the direction of growth. Secondly, despite any past mistakes, we also saw serious reforms. Therefore, the question is quite simple. Are we going to help the Greek people, which is suffering and which has made sacrifices as a member of this family? Are we going to help the Greek people, a people that is helping those who are persecuted while others build fences? And what I can say, without a debt relief which will make the debt sustainable, growth through investments, rational investments, is never going to emerge. There cannot be investments in an economy that has an uncontrollable debt. And as far as concerns the IMF, which requires less austerity, but with preventive measures, that I cannot understand.
The KHDI procedure. First speaker, Madam Spiraki.
Σας ευχαριστώ, κυρία Πρόεδρε.
Thank you, President. Commissioner Moscovici, yes, yesterday the Eurogroup has repeated the November 2012 decision on the debt, but with additional measures with an automatic correction mechanism. This is a decision which was pending for 4 years, and only since January 2015, 9 billion euros have evaded the Greeks in the meantime, and at the same time you as the creditors are also responsible because you are supporting a policy mix which promotes both tax evasion and contribution evasion. Greece does not need new programs. It requires a new policy with fewer spending, a new government which will proceed with structural reforms, so that we cannot be discussing the Greek problem here, so that Greece can become the star at the center of Europe, and so that you can honor your past promises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I think it's absolutely essential that we have a strictly accounting approach to Greece, to help the Greek people above all. I think there are two directions we need to strike out at the same time. Yes, of course, there need to be fundamental reforms. We all know that. State reforms, administration, justice, health reforms. Yet, if these basic reforms had been done, Mr. Tsipras wouldn't have had to have done them now. That's the first point. Secondly, yes, obviously, we have to deal with the debt. We have to reorient the debt. When it comes down to it, we need to provide financial aid, but pump it into constructive development aid projects, reconstructing industry in Greece, for example, reconstructing agriculture, developing new approaches, especially on renewable energies, for example. And to wind up, I think rather than spending our time pointing the fingers at Greece and the Greeks, saying that they're not doing enough, they're not doing it well enough, let us stand shoulder to shoulder with them, and let's fight with them and build a future with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Androulakis. Mr. Androulakis.
Καλό σημάδι, ο λευκός
The white smoke from Eurogroup is a good sign, but the price for the Greek economy is very high. More taxes and social security contributions to those in production is not a good sign for the Greek economy. And there is a generational injustice here. People currently working in Greece will pay more and receive a smaller pension, and the responsibility is with the creditors and the Greek government. So we see that there is a lack of vision in our strategy, and that is why increasingly the Europeans fail to realize the value of yesterday's celebration. And if you realize that if you think that the IMF is a solution to the Greek situation, and if we wanted to leave, then let us vote here for the IMF to leave the Greek program, unless you are only using it as a pretext.
Kelly.
Margaret Uchtron. Coming from Ireland, I have the greatest empathy with the Greek people, and indeed the Greek government right now, because what they're suffering, we suffered. And we heard the same arguments. We were told at the time the debt was too big, that we would default, that we'd be better off out of the Eurozone, that all the money was going to the banks and to lead to no growth in the economy. Well, a few years down the line, thanks to good government and the sacrifices of the Irish people, we are now the fastest growing economy in Europe. And hopefully we can say the same about Greece in a few years' time. And I think, in fairness to Greece and to the Prime Minister, the last time I spoke here I was very critical of him. I told him it was time to show a bit of leadership and stop running around Europe giving interviews to all the media outlets. And in fairness, he has changed, and it takes a big man to change tack and admit the folly of his ways, and especially the grandstanding of his then Financial Minister, the blustering Mr Varoufakis. So now I think that they are making the readjustments. We should do everything we can to be as flexible as possible with the Greek government so that they can make the recovery necessary and enjoy the growth that we are enjoying in Ireland today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Caputo.
Thank you, President. Perhaps we must admit that the EU has committed some mistakes in pressing ahead with its austerity policy, and perhaps it has to be said that the demands on the Greek people were excessive and the measures adopted weren't enough to relaunch the Greek economy. What we've heard from the Eurogroup suggests they are not prepared to change strategy, though. There's a further proposal for restrictive measures and a sort of quota system which would trigger new cuts in expenditure if Athens fails to meet the budget goals written into the programme. In particular, the 3.5% of GDP. Extending the debt repayment period without reducing the amount. Well, the Eurogroup should acknowledge the efforts made by Greece and make the level of debt bearable. You should extend the repayment break for Athens too.
The translators lost you. That's why I said slow down. Thank you. Madam Ruhonen.
Thank you, Madam President. Greece is Greece. That's never going to change. My own party, the True Finns, back in 2010 opposed the support package to Greece. Or rather, it was actually a package for French and German banks because it flowed back to them. The majority takes decisions in a democracy, and back in 2010, we, the True Finns, were in a minority in the Finnish parliament. Shared rules are drawn up so that everybody obeys them. That's the idea. Now the reforms have been carried out in Greece, but though not all of them. And so I think we have to go and we've got to see for ourselves, because I think sometimes people can't be taken at their word. I think Greece has to do its homework before any further steps can be taken to help it out. Or better still, if Greece were to just leave the euro, then it would be able to solve its own problems and improve the situation of its poorest citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last speaker in the procedure, Mr. Chrysogonos.
In yesterday's Eurogroup meeting, it was agreed that the sustainability of the Greek public debt requires short-term, medium-term and long-term measures. All this is good, as long as it is implemented in an effective manner. We should all realize that neither Greece nor any other state, EU member or not, cannot achieve fiscal surpluses of the order of 3.5% a year for decades. Greece must make sure that it is not going to go back to primary deficits, but other Eurozone states should find a way to limit the burden of the Greek debt and make it possible for it to be refinanced by the markets. Generous restructuring should finally be to the benefit both of Greece and of its creditors.
Now I turn to Commissioner Moscovici. You have the floor to wrap up our debate.
Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to express my thanks to those who've spoken during the debate. I think it was a very useful and lively debate. Of course, it's more than just difficult to answer all of your points, seeing as there's a great diversity thereof. And all I can really note is that obviously, yes, mistakes have been made. Yes, we have to find out who's responsible. You can't go through 6 years of crises without noting that there are shortcomings here and there. Now, I do have a good overview, I think, not just during my time at the Commission, in the College of Commissioners, but also prior to that, because I was already involved in the Eurogroup as the finance minister of my country originally, country which is still my country, France. So for 4 years now I've been involved in these discussions, and I can assure you that responsibility for what's gone on is shared. Errors have been committed at many a stage. When it comes down to it, all governments in Greece. The juncture we find ourselves at is a decisive one, and I think we'll need to come up with a consensus of the necessity to push on with our solidarity with Greece. So everybody needs to pull their socks up, do a bit more, and I think it's not up to one or another of people here to say whether the Greek people should stay or not in the Eurozone. I think it's obvious that they should stay in the Eurozone. The choices that we're talking about today, and maybe I'm partisan here, shows that people have that ambition in the longer term. My conviction, and that of the whole Eurogroup, and by definition these are people who are represented in almost all of the groups represented here, men and women who have very different political sensitivities. The step we took yesterday, after a great deal of work, constitutes a very important step. It's a step where a solid reform program is being put in place. It's in train. It's being accepted by everybody and should provide the basis for a return of trust and growth in Greece, with investment that will follow in its wake. And the Greek people, who've suffered a great deal because of this, will benefit from that return to trust and growth. I'm not talking about this or that political government or alliance or authority. I would just say we've worked very well with all of the authorities concerned to get these reforms through, these reforms which are indeed quite painful nevertheless. I think the debate here has provided a great deal of input, looking to the Eurogroup meeting on the 24th of May. I've taken assiduous notes of what has been said here and the items and points you've raised. Of course, if you put yourself in the place of this institution or that government, I think there may be those sort of points reflected or countered. My last comment is to say this is the first occasion that all these issues have been brought together. The question of structural reforms, there's an ambitious package that's being put in place. Then we have a contingency mechanism which will allow us once again, and here the Commission doesn't want necessarily to be involved, and it's the first time since November 2012, because there is a package of reforms on the table which is both solid and credible, that we're now in a position to deal with the issue of debt, the Greek debt. And we will do that, and we want to do that. So I think that yesterday constituted a very important step, I say it again, and I hope that the 24th of May will also flag up a time when we'll be able to reach as broad a possible ranging agreement, hopefully with the two big blocks, hopefully with the entirety of the issues covered. I've heard the speakers from various different countries who have talked about the programs or who wanted Greece to leave the program. You know, that's what I want too. I don't know, on the 24th of May I'll have had, I don't know, 60, 70, 80 meetings, and I hope that one day in a Eurogroup we'll be able to say, that's it, we've got Greece out of the program, they've got themselves out of the program. That should be the objective. If they've implemented the reforms, reintroduced growth, regardless of political sensitivity, I think that is a wish that we can all share. And I think that, in fact, is something that you are all minded to push for. And I would like to say to you all, thank you very much for this debate.
Merci, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Moscovici. That brings this debate to a close. We have a little change here. Mr. Stylianides is coming to take his place And we're going to start the next debate. Ladies and gentlemen, next on the agenda we have Council and Commission statements concerning the preparation of the World Humanitarian Summit. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Ms. Hennis Plasschaert on behalf of the Council.
Merci, Madam Chair. Let me start by saying that, in my view, the summit is an opportunity the global community cannot afford to miss. On Thursday, conclusions on the World Humanitarian Summit are expected to be adopted by the Council, and the Presidency has been at the forefront of preparing a strong common position of the EU and its Member States, obviously in very close cooperation with the Commission and the External Action Service. And let me be clear, the Council wants the World Humanitarian Summit to be a success. From July last year, the Netherlands has put in place an envoy for the World Humanitarian Summit, and this has enabled us to link up early with all key players: the United Nations, humanitarian organizations, EU institutions, the Member States and other UN Member States and stakeholders. Now, let me mention some of the most important things the Member States would like to come out of this summit. We would like the global community to recommit to the humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality and independence. World leaders must also commit to addressing the root causes of humanitarian crisis by stepping up their efforts to resolve conflicts peacefully and to prevent new conflicts from emerging. We want all actors, including those who have influence over parties to a conflict, all of them are to respect international humanitarian law. And let me repeat what I said during our debate in Brussels 2 weeks ago. Violations such as attacks on medical facilities and schools are unacceptable. It will be crucial to keep international humanitarian law high on the international agenda, to hold perpetrators accountable and speak out clearly and publicly against serious violations. Now, upholding international humanitarian law is also linked to a central theme of the summit: placing people at the center of humanitarian action. So we must move away from drawing boards in capitals and truly listen to the affected population. And yes, we must also work towards eradicating sexual and gender-based violence in emergencies. At the same time, I would like to say that women and girls should not only be seen as victims, but as key partners who should be involved in all phases of the humanitarian response cycle. The Presidency also believes that more efficiency in humanitarian assistance can be achieved by promoting innovation. Innovation in financing humanitarian action, innovation in promoting new technologies, innovation in new partnerships. And as an example of the latter, the Netherlands is one of the founding partners of the Global Alliance on Humanitarian Innovation, which is foreseen to be officially launched in Istanbul. Now let me also say, if you will, a few words on humanitarian financing. The Netherlands and other EU member states are among the top 15 global humanitarian donors. Together with Turkey, these donors were invited by the high-level panel on humanitarian financing to negotiate the grand bargain on aid efficiency with the 15 biggest humanitarian implementing organizations. Now, we have lent our full support to the grand bargain negotiations. We hosted the first of the 4 Sherpa meetings in Amsterdam on February 29, and in the course of the negotiations we led, together with the World Bank, the discussions on aid transparency. And let me thank again the Commission and the United Kingdom for hosting the 2nd and 3rd Sherpa meetings. The 4th and last Sherpa meeting, hosted by Sweden, is, as you most probably know, currently ongoing in New York, and let us hope for a swift and successful conclusion of the meeting. And yes, as Presidency of the Council, we would like to see as many donors and humanitarian organizations as possible to sign up to the Grand Bargain and to its suggested commitments. Now, in closing, I would like to thank Parliament for your interest, your guidance and your advice. And the summit participation of this House is a clear demonstration of your dedication and commitment. And obviously, I do look forward to hear a bit more about your views and expectations ahead of the Istanbul summit. Madam Chair, thank you very much.